Hey everyone, I am Magical Hacker, and this is episode number 11 of the Eminence Podcast, the non-CEDH Commander podcast, where I help you in the command zone with your deck building skills, and on the battlefield with your deck piloting skills. This episode is brought to you by New Dark Cloud and the rest of my patrons at patreon.com/magicalhacker. Today's topic is the question, is Phyrexian Arena always good, always bad, or only good in certain decks? If you're aware of the history of Commander, you can probably remember the time when Phyrexian Arena was seen as the go-to card for card draw. You know, the cream of the crop, the pinnacle of card draw. Phyrexian Arena is like the standard that every other card was compared against when it comes to card draw. People loved Phyrexian Arena early on in the Commander format. But now you'll find a lot of people who are not a big fan of it. And some people are actually saying, hey, if you're playing Phyrexian Arena, that's not the best way to play Commander. You're probably missing out on a better card draw spell that you could be playing in that slot. I feel like I've heard the Command Zone mention this, and I'm sure there's plenty of other groups, play groups that have mentioned that. I'm sure there are some members of MTG Goldfish that feel that way. So there are people who like it, people who dislike it, and so it becomes this controversy of, are you on this side or are you on that side? It's like it's a whole new civil war here in Magic Twitter land. And so Phyrexian Arena, is it good? That's the big question for today. Before we start talking about that, I do want to read just a handful of tweets here that show you, at least recently, the people who have been in favor of Phyrexian Arena. So on February 2nd, Benny, who is at Blair Witch Green, wrote, glad that Phyrexian Arena is getting a reprint and should be the cheapest it's been in years. Do y'all still play this in your hashtag Commander decks these days? I do. And if you're not aware of who Benny is, he wrote that book on Commander. He wrote a book about it and had become pretty well known because of that. So that's at Blair Witch Green. Saffron Olive says, hating on Phyrexian Arena in Commander is like hating on 3-mana rocks. Popular but incorrect. Are 3-mana rocks as good as they were a decade ago? No. Are they unplayable trash? Also no. I feel the same about Phyrexian Arena, which I still jam it in almost every black deck. And then Justin Parnell, at jparnell1 on Twitter, said, top 5 Commander cards that are still absolutely playable in 2023. Number 1, Temple of the False God. Number 2, Burnished Heart. Number 3, Phyrexian Arena. Number 4, Coalition Relic. And number 5, Acidic Slime. So, you know, there's certainly a good number of people who have been talking about the fact that they like Phyrexian Arena in Commander, and you can see they're getting 157 likes, 868 likes, 317 likes. There's certainly a lot of people who are showing their support for Phyrexian Arena. So that's the big question: is it as good as it used to be? Is it any good at all? Well, it's certainly not as popular as it used to be. So if we're looking at the kind of towards the early time in Commander, I'm looking back on the Internet Archive Wayback Machine back to September 29th, 2017. It was a magical time. There was no Panini, and we certainly had a lot more faces. So if you're looking on here in the section on Mono Black, Phyrexian Arena was the second most popular card. It was played in 31% of 110,954 black decks. Now, if we're looking at Phyrexian Arena, it is now only played in 12% of the 1,085,374 decks. So from 31% of black decks to now just 12% of black decks in the span of about 6 years. And so that's not the very, very beginning of Commander, but it's certainly far back enough that you can definitely see that contrast of it going way down in popularity. A little bit more reduction than half. So maybe 40% or something along those lines. Just doing the math here quickly in my head. But Phyrexian Arena certainly has become a lot less popular. So let me talk about what people are saying is the reason why they don't like it. And then when I finish talking about that, we'll kind of segue into a topic discussing the multiple types of card draw. So the number one reason that I've seen people talking about why they don't like Phyrexian Arena is that it's too slow. This is kind of the go-to, I don't want to say argument, but it's more so the go-to reasoning behind dislike of Phyrexian Arena. You get it down, maybe on turn 3, but probably later. You get it down for 3 mana. you have to wait a whole turn cycle for the first card draw, which replaces itself. Then you have to wait a whole nother turn cycle before you finally get a second card draw off of it, at which point it becomes equal to a divination that you've had to wait 2 turns for. And then the turn after that, you're finally getting your third card draw. And this is finally when you can start comparing it to something like Painful Truths, which is a 3-mana sorcery, costs 2 generic and a black. You draw cards equal to the number of colors spent to cast the spell, and then you lose that much life. So if you tap, let's say, a Soul Ring and a Swamp, and you play Painful Truths, you're only going to get to draw 1 card off of it, which is very bad. You don't want to do that most often. But if you tap, let's say, an island, a mountain, and a swamp, and you produce 3 different colors of mana and cast that Painful Truths, now for 3 mana, you're drawing 3 cards immediately, and you're losing 3 life immediately. Whereas with Phyrexian Arena, you'd have to wait 3 whole turn cycles in order to do that same thing. So those are the 2 types of card draw. If we're talking about Phyrexian Arena style cards where you're not getting that advantage right away, instead you're having to wait for it, the benefit, though, is that you don't stop losing that card advantage. The longer the game goes on, the more you continue to draw off of it. Whereas on the other side, Painful Truths, you get that value immediately, 3 mana, 3 cards, but you'll only ever get 3 cards from it. You're never going to get a 4th or a 5th or a 6th card from it like you could with Phyrexian Arena. So I like to call these 2 different types of card draw either repeatable card draw in the case of Phyrexian Arena style cards versus burst card draw in the case of Painful Truth style cards. And there are some cards that can kind of mix the 2 types, or they're kind of blurring the lines between the 2. I can't think of any great examples off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's plenty out there where in a typical deck, just a regular old deck, it'll be a burst card draw, but in some decks, because of the recursion that they have, or because of some other effect that allows them to make a copy of it and continue to cast those burst style card draw, it becomes a repeatable card draw. So there are some situations in some decks where that line is a little bit blurrier than you would think of otherwise. But if we're excluding that from the conversation, there's really just those 2 types. Burst card draw, am I getting a big benefit all at once, not getting a benefit later, or repeatable, am I getting a benefit over a long period of time, but it's not concentrated at the very beginning when I'm casting the card specifically. So of those 2, which one do I think is better, and which one do I play more of? I have to say, out of my 16 commander decks, I'm playing in at least 12 or 13 of my decks, I'm only playing repeatable card draw. So way more often than burst card draw, the repeatable card draw I think is what you'd want. Is the type of cards that are really going to be helping you get the card draw that you really need and that you'll really take advantage of much more efficiently. The burst ones, they are playable. I think it depends on the deck. There are some decks that want that and some decks that don't. So let me give you a couple of examples of when I play burst, and then why I don't play burst more often. So the 3 decks that I can think of off the top of my head that I am playing burst style card draw in, and I have mentioned some of these before. The first one that I can think of is a 3-color deck playing Cormella as commander. She's a Grixis commander. I'm not going to read off everything that she says, but she does tap to produce a net of 2 mana. You pay 1 generic and tap her. She produces 3 colored mana. But that mana can only be spent on instants and sorceries. She's also got another ability that when she dies, she returns an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. So in that deck, sure, I could definitely play a Phyrexian Arena. However, she's got recursion. She produces mana for instants and sorceries. In a deck like that, it's probably a better idea to use burst style effect. Not because the burst card is going to be producing more cards than it otherwise would be, but because it's going to be synergistic with the deck. I'm using my commander to produce mana to cast it. Then when my commander dies, I can in a pinch return that card draw to my hand to play it again. And so because of that, burst card draw seems to fit that style of a deck way more. Another similar story is my Midome, the Ageless deck. It's a white-blue control deck. Again, we don't need to go into the commander fully here, but The deck itself is playing a very classic draw-go style of control, where I'm trying to leave up as much mana as possible untapped so that I can interact with my opponents on their turns, either with spot removal spells, with counter spells, and because of Commander's really expansive card pool, with instant speed board wipes as well is certainly a part of it. And so I don't know if you can hear the rain in the background here, but it's certainly pretty loud. We're gonna keep trucking along here. So with Meet of Might of the Ageless, it's a control deck. I want to interact with my opponents on their turns, but there are going to be plenty of turns where using up a spell from my hand on something that my opponents did is a worse outcome than not interacting with it and keeping that card for a problem later on down the road. But that means that I have a bunch of mana that I haven't used. So in that deck, I can get around not using that mana by playing a lot of instant speed card draw spells. And when it comes to repeatable options, not very many of them are at instant speed. Most of them are something you have to cast at sorcery speed. And in white and blue, there are some great options. So I am playing, for example, Rhystic Study and Insight, and I think Mystic Remora, although I could be wrong on that one. I can't remember if I dropped that one because it's been kind of iffy, specifically in that deck, because I keep having to pay that cumulative upkeep cost, which kind of hinders my plan of trying to hold up all my mana untapped. But I know I'm certainly playing Insight and Rhystic Study in that deck because those are really, really good cards. But other than those two, the rest of my card draw, I think, is just instants. All instants that are drawing me cards. And so you can think of it kind of like how players who would cast Sphinx's Revelation in their control decks, so that when they were low on cards or when they didn't need to interact with their opponents, they could draw a bunch of cards at the end step before their turn, so they could then have plenty of options on their turn. And so that's kind of a similar story here. Except instead of playing the X mana ones, I think I'm kind of relying more on the ones that have a fixed cost in order to get more cards for the mana value. So instead of paying 6 mana into a Sphinx's Revelation to draw 3 cards, instead now I'm paying 6 mana into an Opportunity, I think is the name of the card, that draws me 4 cards. So there's some benefits there to not going for the X mana costed instance. So I'm using that one in that deck. The third deck that I can think of that I use burst style card draw is my Ronos the Indomitable. It's a mono green commander deck. And the commander has a lot of really important abilities here. But just remember, it's one of the gods from Amonkhet, so it has Indestructible. And it doesn't allow itself to untack or block unless it meets a certain condition. In this case, you have to have another creature with power 4 or greater. But it itself is a 3-mana creature with 5 power and 5 toughness. So it's a 3-mana 5/5 that just can't attack or block until you actually have another creature with power 4 or greater. Now, the reason this is so cool is because there are lots of 5-drop cards in Commander. Again, very big card pool. 5 mana cards that allow you to draw cards equal to the power of target creature you control, or the creature with the greatest power. Sometimes they don't target. But either way, we have a lot of those cards in that deck, and the reason that I've chosen to play those cards there is because in another deck, you might find that they're not as good for card draw, right? Because you first got to get a big creature out in order to get a bunch of cards off of them. And while green is probably the best color at doing that, you can't always rely on that. You can't be ready to do that first when you need to have card draw. Sometimes you're going to find yourself in a situation right after a board wipe and you have very few cards in hand. Those card draw spells are not going to be very effective because you first have to draw into a creature with a big power so that your card draw can then be good. And so that's, the problem is the solution at the same time. And so that's the issue, where in those situations, your solution to the problem is held back by the problem itself. The difference here, though, is in Ronos the Indomitable, because it's got Indestructible, and because it's cheap, and because it's a 5/5, those cards are almost always good. You'll never find yourself in a situation, at least when I've been playing the deck, where those cards haven't been just really, really powerful. So I am playing some repeatable card draw in that deck as well. Coming to mind is Compost, 2-mana enchantment in green, that says whenever a black card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you draw a card. I think it may be a May ability, so you may draw a card. But Compost is too good for me not to include it. But other than that one, I think the majority of the remaining card draw spells I have in that deck are all that burst style effect, sometimes with Rishkar's Expertise, which is a 6-mana version that draws cards equal to the power of a creature you control. And I've also got, there's a Garruk, I think it's Garruk Primal Hunter, that has a -3 ability that does the same thing. You draw cards equal to the power of target creature you control, and it enters with 3 loyalties for a 5-mana Planeswalker. So it also enters the battlefield on turn 5, if I'm low on cards for some reason on turn 5. But for 5 mana later on in the game when I'm low on cards in hand, I can play this one down. It comes to play with 3 loyalty. I immediately -3, immediately draw those at least 5 cards, sometimes more. And so those are some benefits here in terms of those cards. So kind of wrapping things up about those 3 commander decks. Why am I playing burst style card draw? Either A, I've got some type of synergy with instants and sorceries. B, I'm playing specific cards that rely on a specific deck theme, so there's that synergy there. Or C, I'm playing a control deck that wants to be playing things at instant speed, and so I'm relying more on instants. Those are the 3 examples I can think of off the top of my head where I'd like to be playing burst style card draw more so than repeatable card draw. If you can think of any example where you'd want to be playing burst style card draw more than repeatable card draw, and it doesn't fit one of those 3 categories, I'd love to hear about it. I'll mention it here at the end of this episode before we talk about answering people's comments from previous episodes. I'll talk about what you can do if you want to tell me about it, because I'd love to hear about it. In my opinion, burst is kind of like a band-aid. And the only exception to that is when it's in theme. When it's in theme, it's working well, it's very powerful, and its sheer power overshadows its limitations that it naturally has in comparison to repeatable card draw. So burst, that's how I view it. I view it as a band-aid. If you're playing a 3-mana, like let's say we're talking about the Painful Truths again. If you're playing that Painful Truths, and let's say you have 2 cards in hand, including that Painful Truths, you're certainly low on cards. You want to draw cards as quickly as possible. So you play that Painful Truths, now you're up to 4 cards. Well, if you play a card next turn, and you play a land, then you're very close to where you started off in the beginning. You're still lacking the cards in hand, and you want to get back to that point. Now, of course, Phyrexian Arena, it doesn't help in that situation as much either, because you're only drawing 1 card per turn. But the benefit is you don't have to wait until you're low in cards in hand in order to play the Phyrexian Arena. I can have 7 cards in hand, play the Phyrexian Arena down, and even without having a maximum hand size, even with having that maximum hand size of 7, I can just continue to draw 1 card per turn and either play a land and cast a spell every turn, or not play a land and cast 2 spells in a single turn, which happens more later on. But I can definitely use up 2 cards from my hand every turn and never go below that 7 card starting point with Phyrexian Arena. Whereas with Painful Truths, I can't really cast it effectively if I've got 7 cards in hand, because then I'll have to discard some cards. So I do have to wait first until I'm low enough in cards in hand to the point at which I need it. And then once I've cast it, then at that point where I need it, I still need something else later on to be able to continue to keep myself at that point. So if your games are ending super quickly, I could definitely see an argument for where Painful Truth style, burst style card draw is more effective than repeatable card draw. But that's not been my experience, and I don't think that's the experience of most players playing non-CEDH Commander. If we're looking at stats just across the board, you're looking at different YouTube channels, maybe even looking at Twitch streams, I think you'll find that majority of games are ending somewhere between turn 9 at the earliest and maybe turn 15, turn 14 at the latest. That's kind of the typical range for where a Commander game is ending. And you'll notice that's a pretty big range. 15 is almost just three turns away from being twice as long as turn 9. So that's a pretty big range. But even in that pretty big range, those are all certainly very long games where I would argue Phyrexian Arena is certainly going to be more effective than Painful Truths because of how long the game lasts. So even if, let's say, on turn 6, you're casting your Phyrexian Arena, then that means at bare minimum, you're going to be getting a Phyrexian Arena that's going to be producing as much value as a Painful Truths, as long as it sticks around on the board, of course. And at most, I mean, you're going to be drawing, what is that, like 3 or 4 times as many cards as a Phyrexian Arena, because from turn 6 all the way to turn 15, that's 9 cards. So yeah, you're going to be drawing three times as many cards compared to a Painful Truths. So that's my perspective when it comes to burst style card draw versus when it comes to repeatable card draw. I think repeatable card draw is still the option you want to rely on more, unless there are certain exceptions where, because of the way the deck works, whether it's due to synergy or due to its style, you'd want to rely more on burst. So what about Phyrexian Arena specifically? We asked the question at the very beginning of the show: is it always good? Is it always bad? Or is it only good in certain decks? I certainly think that always bad is crossed off. I don't think that's certainly the case here at all. Is it always good? I would also say no. I don't think Phyrexian Arena is always a good card. I'm certainly not playing it in 100% of my black decks. And part of the reason for that is not just because I've got my Cormella deck, the blue-red-black deck that is playing a lot of burst-style card draw. It's because there are a lot of decks that I've got that are not playing those decks. So when I'm looking here at my decks, I've got it in about 3, maybe 4 of my decks that are good, but it's not being played in all 8, right? So there are certainly some decks that are not playing the Phyrexian Arena. So what are some cards that would fit into a mono black deck that are better than Phyrexian Arena? Well, when it comes to things that are good just regardless of the theme, there isn't anything. Phyrexian Arena, in terms of a card for card draw, is probably the best option in black if you're not playing a specific theme that allows other cards to be better. So kind of strategy independent cards that are available in mono black, Phyrexian Arena I would say is at the top, number 1 spot. But if you're playing other cards and you're playing a deck theme where, for example, let's say you're playing a deck that's causing opponents to discard cards. Well, Waste Not and Asylum Visitor and Geth's Grimoire, those are cards available in mono black that I would say are probably better than Phyrexian Arena. They're more effective in a deck like that. If you're playing a deck that has a high mana curve, let's say your average mana cost is more than maybe like 2.5 or 3, and specifically you're not playing a theft deck, then I would go for Protection Racket. And the reason I say here not a theft deck for Protection Racket has to do with the way theft works. You don't want to be drawing too much attention to yourself, and Protection Racket does reveal those cards, and so you can basically get so many people against you in those situations that maybe in a theft deck, Protection Racket is not a great idea. So there are some cards that I think are better, in certain decks. Another example here, if you're playing a life gain deck, Black Market Connections I think is a great option. Some people do like to play that just in every deck. In my opinion, I think paying 2 life to draw 1 card is probably a little bit, I won't say it's a ripoff, but it's getting to that point where it's not a good deal. If I were to go buy something, even if it's something I really want, I don't want to be paying too much for it. And I think once you're paying 2 life for a card, in my opinion, I think that's too much of a cost. Now, if you've got loads of mana, and you're not worried about wasting, if you have loads of life, you're not worried about wasting life. It's the same thing as in life. If you have something you really want and you've got plenty of money, you might not be as worried about wasting money on something that's not necessarily a good deal. Black Market Connections, I think, kind of falls into that same level where you want it to be really used more often when you're playing a life gain deck where you can use the life and not have to worry so much about using too much life all at one time. The last few cards I want to talk about here, specifically for tokens, and this includes non-creature tokens as well, like treasures and clues, food, blood, power stone, all those non-creature artifacts. I really like Idol of Oblivion. It's essentially a 2-mana Phyrexian Arena, but if you can make a token the turn it enters, it also gives you that card draw immediately. And of course, if you have synergies with untapping artifacts while you're making your tokens, you can then untap Idol of Oblivion and continue to tap it for card draw. I don't know if I would ever use the other ability that creates a big Eldrazi token. Personally, I think I just love it for the card draw. So that one's another card I really like. And then, of course, Braid's Arisen Nightmare, kind of in a similar situation. When you're playing treasures, clues, foods, and other non-creature artifact, Braid's Arisen Nightmare is a really good card for drawing cards because you can sacrifice one of those non-creature artifacts, and then you'll draw 3 cards unless somebody, happens to sacrifice a non-creature artifact. Or, technically they could sacrifice an artifact creature as well. But if they sacrifice an artifact, you just draw 1 fewer card. So for 3 mana, to draw up to 3 cards per turn just by sacrificing a treasure, that's really good. So I've got that in my Sultai treasure deck. So when it comes to Phyrexian Arena, I think the way to summarize it is Phyrexian Arena is good, but there are better options depending on what deck you're playing. And of course, this is just talking about the mono black options. I'm not even going into all the amazing options that we've got in blue and in green, and even now kind of in white and sometimes red. So there are plenty of really good card draw options where Phyrexian Arena might not be good enough to fit your deck, but certainly something that could happen from time to time. But that's just my take. If you disagree, or if you have any questions, please leave me a comment at youtube.com/magicalhackermtg, or a tweet at twitter.com/magical__hacker. Speaking of which, let's take a look at some of the questions that you all left for me in the past. On episode 1, titled Do I Need 6 Mana in Commander, D Many says, great breakdown here, can't wait for more of the series. Thank you for the kind words, friend. Really appreciate it. On that same episode, Savino Balducci says this: doubling your average mana value and deciding which ramp to run based on that is a very interesting way to proceed. I find it very boring when content creators generally say that now 2 mana ramp is the only way to go. Another method to decide which ramp to run is simply looking at your commander's CMC if you want it out ASAP. I have to agree. So D Many's article is what we talked about in episode 1. And applying it to maybe a little bit of a different spin, talking about how we would use it to double the average mana value and decide which ramp to run based on that. I really like that idea. I think the way I described it was D Many explained why my approach was working better than I could explain it. And I was trying to explain it in a different way, and then D Many comes around and says this other thing that I wasn't even thinking about. And then it's like, oh wow, that's maybe why I've been having so much success with my approach when it comes to ramp. But I have to agree with Savino here. I don't like it when content creators say, hey, if your mana ramp is costing more than 2 mana, that's a very bad idea, because I don't think that's worth it. And I'd like to just take a few seconds here to put a small teaser for a future episode when we talk about ramp. When we're looking at a card like Rampant Growth, it's 2 mana, we're getting out 1 land from our library onto the battlefield. If that Rampant Growth instead were a land, then that means we could get it out onto the battlefield for free. Don't have to pay the 2 mana. And we still just use 1 card up from the hand. The only difference is Rampant Growth allows you to get that land onto the battlefield earlier because you're getting around the 1 land per turn rule, and a land in the hand wouldn't. So, in other words, Rampant Growth is only better than a land when you're making your land drops. Once you miss a land drop, that Rampant Growth that you cast early on is as good as a land is now. You're not getting any advantage. You're not getting any ramp once you get to that point. In comparison, let's say we're looking at something like a Skyshroud Claim. 4 mana spell that gets you 2 lands from your library onto the battlefield. There will never be a point in time where a land will be just as good as a Skyshroud Claim, because no matter what turn of the game it is, Skyshroud Claim will always be worth 2 lands until you run out of basic lands in your deck. Hashtag play more basics. And so Skyshroud Claim, in my opinion, I think is a much better card than Rampant Growth. So I have to agree here with Savino. I don't like it when content creators say that 2 mana ramp is the only way to go, because they're missing such a huge part of what makes ramp cards potentially good, is when it's better than a basic land in all situations of the game. So that's one thing I want to say here. And then the last thing here, looking at your commander's CMC if you want it out ASAP. I do mention this from time to time, but trying to get your commander out as fast as possible is not only not a good idea, it's also possibly a bad idea. So there was a funny video. I'm going to try to post it in the description down below. It was made by man, what was that guy's name? He was super funny. I liked this video a lot because it was a humorous approach to this idea, and it was just really well done, I thought. It's gonna bug me now. Can't remember his name. I think, was it Mono White Border? Maybe. I might be mixing it with somebody else, though. I'll certainly try to find that video and post it in the description below. But in this skit, this guy was playing as multiple players at the table, and one player on turn 2 played a Signet or something, and then on turn 3 they played their 4-drop commander, right? So turn 1 play a land, turn 2 play a land and get another mana source out, and then turn 3 play the 4th land and play their 4-mana commander. And then after this, they said, okay, good game, I won, guys. And the other people are like, well, what are you talking about? He's like, I played my 4-drop commander on turn 3. That means I win. And everybody's like, what are you talking about? He's like, no, it means I win because I've done this thing. And so kind of putting a humorous spin to the idea that people are always talking about, play a 4-mana commander and get it out on turn 3, like that's the way to win commander, when that's not the case at all. That's not a big deal. And so the reason I think it's potentially a bad idea is because when everybody starts the game, everybody's got 7 cards in hand. From there, you'll always find, I can't think of a single situation where every single player on turn 6 also has 7 or more cards in hand or more. And I've never seen that. It's always been at least somebody's got fewer cards in hand than that. And because of that, the beginning of the game is where people have the most answers. So if you're playing your commander out as fast as possible, that just makes it more likely that it's going to get hit by a board wipe. So it might not even be a bad idea to first wait for a board wipe and then play out your commander. That way you don't have to pay the commander tax later on. There are certainly some examples where that's not a good idea because you want your commander to die, or you want it to be in the graveyard or something along those lines, and so you're not upset by a board wipe on your commander. Or maybe your commander provides so much value when it's on the battlefield that the value you get between when you cast it and when the board wipe happens is so great that you're okay with losing your commander to the board wipe and having to pay the mana tax 2 more for every subsequent cast compared to not playing it that early. Maybe those are situations where you want to be playing your commander out as fast as possible. But in my opinion, I don't think that's the norm. I don't think that's like the goal. And I think if you have that goal, if you try to go for that, I think it's going to end up hurting you more than helping you in the long run. All right, we have time for one more question here. Jerhavon, a.k.a. Breffin, says, ever the conundrums over when to engage in spells. I like the little 1 to 2 mana ramp plays, but because it's easier to thread those in with other spells. Advancing gameplay in multiple ways. My current mood is to try and make sure I get my land drop each turn at the very least. Definite reasons to go to Cultivate or Verdant Mastery, because you ramp and have your next land drop. But having that Nature's Lore means that turn 4 play a ramp spell and a 3-mana play is still an option. As to getting the max out of a card, my most extreme case so far is Akiri and Miara with Lurrus as companion. Lacking typical ramp, but not because the cards are mostly cheap, but because I'm asking all these little 1 to 2 drops to provide insane amounts of value and rectangles for the cost. And Arcane Signet just isn't there. I had a game where I was doing full Blood Fountain and Lurrus loops, costly on mana, but I'd been consistently making my land drops, so plenty of chances to keep grinding out value. While I don't really build for plays and follow-up plays, I do build with a vision of my mana and early turns. What do my early turns look like? When do I want to deploy my commander? What circumstances does my commander prefer? And so on. Windgrace got a number of 1-drop mana ramp and some 2-mana explosive options, so that a turn 3 Windgrace isn't all the time, but it is a possibility. Tovolar wanted to come down with active wolves in play, and those are 4-ish mana, so it's turn 2 ramp, turn 3 4-drop werewolf, turn 4 Tovolar, swing with the other werewolf to draw a card. And Sir Gwyn wants 2 equipped creatures on the board when she comes into play, and she costs 6, a tall order in very few cards. Gwyn's ramp is nothing special, but the deck really likes cheap living weapons for card economy like the ramp you prefer. 1 to 3 mana, get an equipped creature off a single card. So, really big response here, but I love it. I love having these big responses because it gives me a lot to talk about, and I think that's really cool. So, kind of starting off here at the beginning, Breffin mentions going to, trying to ramp and do other things at the same time. kind of tying it into what D-Many was talking about. What are your big plays, your combination of cards that you're playing at the same time in the same turn? And so Breffin here is talking about going for that ramp spell and then for another spell. And I was kind of answering this already, but I can definitely touch on it again. Rampant Growth is as good as a land that costs 2 mana if you've missed your land drop. So as long as you keep hitting your land drops, Rampant Growth is good. But if you were instead deciding to wait a little bit longer before acting out your game plan, I think that'll have 2 benefits. Maybe 3 here. Let's talk about 3, because we're including, first of all, it allows you to be playing ramp spells that provide more ramp for the number of cards you're casting from your hand. You're using up from your hand. And so that's certainly one good thing. You're getting a benefit there. You're allowing yourself to use the better ramp spells that'll be better for you in the late game. The second benefit here is you're allowing yourself to save more of your cards in hand for in the late game. So you're not playing as many things early on. That's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing, because now you have more things to play later in the game. And then the third one, kind of tying into that one, is because you're not playing those things in the early game, you're also not as much of a threat. So opponents are not looking at you very scared of what you're doing because you've ramped out a lot in the early game. That's part of why Sol Ring coming down on turn 1 typically results in fewer wins compared to more wins, even though Sol Ring is probably the most powerful card in the entire format when it comes to ramp. So, it's something that we would think like automatically, if you get it down on the first turn, certainly that increases your win percentage, but because we're playing in a multiplayer format, that actually isn't the case. So, that kind of touches to trying to go for the ramp combined with combined with another play at the same time, I think is not as helpful as you might think. I think it might not actually be as a good idea as we as Magic players like to think it is. I definitely did like the idea of having a vision of the mana, but I don't think the early turns are as important. I think it's more important to say, what do my late turns look like? On turn 7, do I want to have 9 mana or 10 mana, and then what do I want to combine together? I think that idea of planning out is probably a more important vision, more important plan than what does my turn 2 look like? What does my turn 3 look like? I don't have a whole lot of my YouTube videos still on my YouTube channel, but if you had watched it, you will know that many times my turn 2 and even my turn 3, I'm not even casting anything. Certainly my turn 1 is also the same story, but that's kind of par for the course in the format. But turn 1, 2, 3, I'm not really casting a whole lot. Maybe I'm casting 1 card in those first 3 turns, but more often than not, I'm not even playing anything at all, turn 1, 2, or 3, and that's okay. Like I said, I think there's certain benefits to doing that. It allows me to be better prepared for winning the game later on for those reasons that I mentioned before. I do think it's important, for example, the Akiri Miara Luris deck was mentioned here. Of course, you've got to look at your deck. Sometimes your decks are going to have restrictions that are going to prevent you from playing the best possible cards. Sometimes it's more so the cards that are typically seen as worse are now better. For example, I could see myself wanting to be playing a Rampant Growth in a deck that has, for example, something that can copy spells in the command zone, so that way I can play the Rampant Growth and copy it, and now it turns into a Skyshroud Claim. Certainly I can see myself doing that for Rampant Growth, but otherwise, I don't really see myself wanting to use that card because I don't see it as a very good card in general. So that kind of wraps up things here for our time for answering questions for today. If you want to pick the topic for an episode of the Eminence podcast, just like New Dark Cloud, check out patreon.com/magicalhacker. In fact, the question for the next episode will be, can I build a commander deck that is good in multiplayer and 1v1? And I'm going to call this one the Wizard Standoff Riddle, because that's going to come into the conversation here as well. So make sure to subscribe on YouTube or follow on Spotify to get notified of that episode when it comes out. Thank you again to New Dark Cloud. Thank you to all of my patrons, and thank you for listening. Stay awesome, everybody.